Welcome to the NFL Saturday Podcast. This is Amp, and I'm here to catch you up on fantasy football for the week, and we'll have some fun along the way. Today, let's talk about opening night, and also some things to look for in week 1. But first, I'm going to give you your fun fact of the day in honor of Cooper Kupp and Stefon Diggs having great games. The youngest player in the NFL to get 1,000 receiving yards is Kyle Pitts. He actually beat out Mike Evans last year by 2 months, who used to be the youngest player with 1,000 yards receiving. There are actually 7 total players who were 21 years old when they got 1,000 receiving yards. But Kyle Pitts is the youngest since his birthday is in October. And he's also the only tight end, which I thought was actually pretty cool. So now I'm going to go into the opening game highlights and my takeaways before I get into what you should look for in week 1 for fantasy. So first off, if you didn't see the game, definitely a interesting game to say the least. The Bills' offense looked amazing. I mean, they were dominant all game, essentially. The only reason it was tied at half was because they had turnovers that made it look a lot closer. I think the Rams' defense still looks pretty good. I just think the Bills' offense looked amazing. Diggs is still a top-tier receiver, which is why I drafted him in the first round, essentially. And Gabriel Davis looks good, but he could be inconsistent and touchdown reliant. He did have a high snap count, though, so I think it's still up in the air. But, I mean, he looks good. Isaiah McKenzie definitely does seem more unreliable. We kind of thought he would get more of that slot role, but it seemed like he was splitting it with Jamison Crowder. So I'm kind of a little more hesitant on them. If you are in best ball, I wouldn't be too worried if you have McKenzie. But in standard, I definitely think I'm going to wait to see if I should play McKenzie. Essentially, the one downside, I think, was the running back room. It looks like a mess. Singletary looked the best, but it didn't seem like the coaches wanted to play him on every snap. It seemed much more like a committee, which was the concern. It's kind of what happened last year. I don't really trust the coaches to play him, even though he did look the best. I mean, the other 2 running backs fumbled, so I don't know. I'm staying away from those running backs. I mean, I didn't really have any shares of them to begin with, but if you do have shares, I would try to look for other options. The Rams offense looked pretty shaky, however. I'm definitely worried about the Rams offense. Could just be that the Bills are an elite defense. The Bills defense did look really good. I think there's still some room for hope. I mean, this was Matthew Stafford's worst performance, or second worst performance, I think. I don't know. But since he joined the Rams, so it was a pretty bad performance fantasy-wise. Cooper Kupp, obviously, though, is still the man. Like, he's Stafford's guy. When Stafford gets uncomfortable, he runs around and tries to find Cooper Kupp. The other thing, I'm not worried about Allen Robinson yet. I think Allen Robinson still could bounce back, especially, I don't remember who they're playing. I think it was Atlanta or Houston. I don't know. It was a team where I think he'll get hyper-targeted because it does seem like they've realized they kind of made a mistake by not targeting him. He looked wide open on some of the plays. I just overall, I don't know. I'm a little hesitant to play him, but if you did draft him, you're probably going to play him next week. And I think just kind of ride or die. It's one of those things where you don't really have any other choices, probably. If you do, then you may want to pivot, but I do think that he's going to have a bounce back week. His snap percentage was still really high, so again, I'm not super worried. Someone I am very worried about, though, is Cam Akers. I wasn't drafting him anyways because I did hear rumors that Darrell Henderson was probably picking up more snaps and there was a 50-50, but after seeing that, I mean, that was a terrible sign. He had 3 carries for 0 yards, I think, and he just looked bad. And on top of that, he wasn't getting opportunities. That said, I think Darrell Henderson looked like the clear lead back. He had 18 touches, which is huge. I mean, if you don't really know the metrics, I'm kind of going to go over them later, but usually 13 is like a amazing mark, or a good mark, I would say. So 18 is really good. it seems like they trust him when they kind of need him, They had him on the field. He was catching a lot of passes, which is good. So I'm excited about him. If you did have him, this is a huge win. The other interesting thing is that Tyler Higbee actually had 11 targets. He only had I don't know, he only had a couple catches and 30-something yards, but it was interesting. It seemed like it seems like Stafford wasn't comfortable throwing to Allen Robinson yet, so maybe some of those targets go away if Allen Robinson does get more targets, but we'll see. I'm still kind of up in the air on Higbee, but 11 targets is obviously a good sign for a tight end. Now, we're going to do Ask Anissa, where I ask my wife, Anissa, a football question, and she knows nothing about football, so this is going to be fun. So, Anissa, who are you most excited about? Cooper Kupp, Stefon Diggs, or Darrell Henderson Jr.?
One more time.
Cooper Kupp, Stefon Diggs, or Darrell Henderson Jr.?
Darrell for sure.
Darrell?
Yeah.
All right. Solid.
That's a solid name. It's a very strong name.
Strong name.
I'm betting on him.
Got you. So she clearly likes her running backs. So let's. So definitely pick up Darrell Henderson or trade for him. Now let's get into the things that you should be paying attention to in week 1. So my first thing is don't overreact. This is only week 1. It's not the whole season. Plenty of players break out and then fade out into nothing, like Sammy Watkins has done a couple times. Or they do bad in the beginning, but then they break out later in the season, like Najee Harris. I think he had a pretty bad week 1 last year, but then the rest of the season, obviously, he kind of broke out. So now I'm going to go position by position, what I'm kind of looking for to kind of give me an idea if they just had a bad game, but they're still getting the opportunity stuff like that, and how they look in general. So first is QBs. For QBs, I feel like it is more of a feeling thing. How do they look passing the ball? Are they accurate? Are they missing throws? Or is it the receivers dropping passes? Like even Josh Allen looked amazing on Thursday. He had a couple picks, but if you look at the picks, they didn't seem like they were entirely his fault. So, especially the first one. The first one was definitely not his fault. It was Isaiah McKenzie dropping it. So, I think that's something you really should look at. If there are any picks or mistakes or something, who's actually at fault? Also, is the offense moving down the field easily? The Rams, obviously, bad vibes from them. I wasn't loving the way Matthew Stafford was looking, and also they were not moving it easily. But the Bills are the complete opposite. They were just weaving down the field, and you really want that. If they can move down the field, even if the quarterback isn't getting a ton of the plays, if they're running a bunch, I still like them just moving down the field. I also think about the matchup. That's the last thing I think about for quarterbacks. If it's easy, if it's hard, if it's easy and they're not looking good, then that's a really bad sign. But if it's a hard matchup and they're not looking good, I'm definitely a little more lenient. I'll probably run them back another week, see how they actually are. I won't panic, but that's kind of what I'm looking for. I feel like quarterbacks is much more of a feel-based thing. There's not as many stats that I go by because it kind of is matchup reliant, and I don't think it tells the whole story. So the next position is running backs, and running backs I feel definitely is a little more stats-based. I pay attention to touches for running backs. Typically 13 touches is a good mark. You want to see that in a lot of the running backs. I mentioned Najee Harris last year when he got over 13 touches, I believe, and that was a good sign that he actually is the lead back. Same with Darrell Henderson. I'm really excited because he got 18 touches, which is huge, and it's typically the number you want your running backs to hit. That's what I've heard from other podcasts and just other fantasy experts. So definitely look for that 13 mark if they don't have a good game. If they have a good game and they're not getting 13 touches, maybe they got a couple good plays or a couple huge plays or just a couple touchdowns. For example, if Michael Carter comes out week 1 and is getting 8 touches, but he has 2 touchdowns, that's concerning. Even though he got 2 touchdowns, I might try to trade him for value because he got 2 touchdowns. I think that's something you can look at. Also, who is getting the goal line carries? I mean, if they're not getting the goal line carries, that is something to worry about. I think this one is much more a case-to-case basis because some of the running backs obviously aren't really meant to get those goal line carries. They kind of, like, for example, New England might be completely split on that. Like, you might have Stevenson come in for the goal line carries only, something like that. It's kind of, you just have to know the team, what they're planning on doing. This one's a little more tricky, so I would say focus more on the touches, probably. That's kind of an easier metric just to follow. Also, who is getting the third down work? I think this is really important for certain situations. Obviously, if you're looking at a running back who doesn't catch passes, then I wouldn't worry as much about this because you kind of already knew that when you were drafting them. But for running backs who you expected to get the third down work and to get the passing down work, it could be a really bad sign if they're not getting that. So definitely pay attention to that if your running back is supposed to be getting that. Also, who is running in the 2-minute drills? That usually determines for me how much they really value that player. If the Washington Commanders, my bad, if the Washington Commanders are running with J.D. McKissic instead of Antonio Gibson, I mean, we already weren't liking Antonio Gibson, but now if J.D. McKissic is also taking those 2-minute drills, I think that's a good sign for McKissic, really bad sign for Antonio Gibson. Also, last one is, are they running routes or blocking on passing plays? I mean, obviously, again, this is determined by team to team because some players, you're not expecting them to catch as many passes. Derrick Henry, you're not expecting to catch as many passes. But if it is a receiving back, if Christian McCaffrey is coming back and he's not receiving as much, then that would be a concern. I mean, I don't think that's going to be the case. I think he's a stud, but just something to keep an eye on. So now let's go over to wide receivers. The first thing I pay attention to is snap count. I think that's a very good sign of how they like the player, how much they're playing, at least how much the coach likes the player. I think for Allen Robinson, it does seem like they brought him in, they paid him a lot. The coaches and probably the management really like him, but he might not have that chemistry with Stafford yet. So I think that's something that could develop throughout the season. So I'm paying attention more to the snap count for now, but I'm still a little worried. I'm not going to lie. If you get like no targets, but you have a high snap count, that is a little concerning. However, I think you still need to wary that concern because he could just have had a bad week. The next thing I pay attention to is targets, and also if you get any red zone or 10 zone targets. You always see this a lot with some of those big body receivers. If Davante Adams doesn't get that many end zone targets, that's a little concerning because that's something that you'd expect him to get moving to Las Vegas. Obviously, we don't really know how the chemistry is going to work from college, if it's still there, but we'll kind of see how that plays out. Hopefully, they can rekindle their college friendship or chemistry, I guess. And obviously, I mean, Derek Carr and Davante Adams, but yeah, that's something to pay attention to. Are they getting the goal line targets, 10 zone targets, and also just how many targets they're getting, because that kind of shows you how the quarterback feels about it or how comfortable they are throwing to them. So another thing I look at is, do they have any key drops? Because I feel like sometimes you can kind of lose that trust when you get those key drops. Or, for example, like the Isaiah McKenzie thing, that really concerns me because after he dropped that catch and the guy picked it, it did kind of bring down the vibe. You notice he wasn't out there as much, and it seemed like he wasn't getting as targeted as much. So that's definitely a little concerning in my eyes. I think that's something you need to pay attention to is like, if they mess up, are they suddenly not getting targets anymore? It really depends on the team. Obviously, I think there will be a little more leniency on certain teams, but I definitely do pay attention to that kind of stuff as well. And then lastly, who does the QB look for under pressure or in clutch moments? Kind of like I mentioned earlier, where Matthew Stafford was looking for Cooper Kupp when he was under pressure. And who is that quarterback looking for when they're having pressure? Because that really just shows who they're most comfortable with. That's how I look at it, at least. So now I'm going to move on to the tight ends. And the first thing I look for in tight ends is, are they blocking or running routes on passing plays? I think this is a big thing. Obviously, you probably already knew this. Certain tight ends definitely lean more towards the blocking side, and certain tight ends lean more towards the running side. Hopefully you kind of determine this before your draft, but if you didn't and you're noticing your tight end is not running routes, that's a really bad sign. That's why I don't really look at snap count as much for tight ends because, I mean, a lot of the tight ends, they just vary. Some of them are not blocking at all, so they're not going to be out there on key goal line formations where they're running the ball. But some tight ends are not catching passes and they're going to be out there a lot just to block. So you got to really know what your snap count is really looking like, because not all snaps are the same for tight ends. So the next thing I look at is targets in the red zone and 10 zone. Again, same with wide receivers, except tight ends, I think it's more crucial because tight ends are typically so touchdown reliant. So example, again, I guess I'll go back to Darren Waller. Is he still getting the red zone targets now that Davante Adams is there? We'll see. There's a lot of other tight ends. Is David Njoku getting them in Cleveland? I mean, there's so many tight ends I could just run through where you really want to pay attention to, are they getting looked at in the red zone? And obviously, you're not going to get great opportunities every week, so I wouldn't hold it too highly. It's more if they're in the red zone and 10 zone and they're passing and they're not getting looked at, that's a bad sign. You kind of might not be able to see if the quarterback is going through his reads or not, but if you can just see if he's looking at the tight end first or tight end side of the field first, that's a good sign, or a better sign than not looking at him at all. So lastly, I'm looking at, are they getting looked at in clutch moments? Kind of the same with wide receivers. If they're under pressure and they're getting thrown to, getting targets when the quarterback's under pressure, that's a good sign. So yeah, that is actually going to be it for what I'm looking for in week 1. Just want to keep it short and sweet. Don't want to get too heavy into it because I think these podcasts are probably going to be like that. So now it's time for my strong opinion of the day. And my strong opinion is that watching football at home is better than going to the stadium.